I'm Rosie. I'm both a behavioural scientist and a user researcher. I'm a former academic, often say recovering academic. So I have a PhD in health psychology. But for the last few years, I've been working in user research in digital health startups, most recently, as Anya said, Babylon Health, where I established the behavioural science practice within the business. I now work in applied science at a company called Zinc, where I help people bring both behavioural science and research into their work. So before I kind of dive into the content, I just wanted to say a little bit about Zinc, because I think a lot of people haven't quite heard of us yet, and what we're doing is a bit different and I think exciting. So Zinc exists to tackle society's big problems, particularly by bringing together knowledge and skills from the social sciences with entrepreneurship. We have a number of programs, but our flagship program, which I work on, is our Venture Builder. And for this, we take in a cohort of 70 talented people from a variety of backgrounds to build a new company centered around a particular social good mission. So the current program focuses on the mental health of children and young people. And the cohort, when they come in, are both pre-team and pre-idea. So myself and the rest of the R&D team support them in bringing both science and research-led approach to understanding the problem and then coming up with great impactful solutions. So today I plan to talk to you about behavioural science and give you some guidance on how to bring it into your work. So I'll start by introducing the concept of behavioural science and then what I call the behavioural science toolkit, and lastly give you some examples of what it looks like in action. So what actually is behavioural science? What do we mean by this? Behavioural science is the systematic study of human behaviour. It's essentially the scientific study of how do we change behaviour, how do we get people to do things differently. And it includes lots of different fields, including psychology, behavioural economics, and more. Now, some of you might be familiar with the concept of nudge or have read books around it. Now, behavioural science includes nudge, but also so much more. And what it gives us is it helps us to understand behaviour, gives us evidence-based ways to change it, and also methods for measuring our impact and then learning from this. And I guess the pertinent point for today as user researchers is around understanding the behaviour. So this is something as researchers we seek to do every day, and I am hopefully going to convince you that behavioural science can help us with this. So you might think as a researcher that you're an expert in understanding behaviour, and you absolutely are. However, we can always be seeking to improve what we're doing. And often in design, we're trying to change people's behaviour, and this is really, really hard. If it wasn't, we'd all be perfectly healthy, wouldn't ever make any choices that are bad for us, and which I know certainly for me, that's not the case. So here on the slide, you can see some examples of behaviours that you might be trying to change depending on what your product and business area is. So if you work for an online supermarket service, you might be trying to get shoppers to do weekly meal planning. If you work for a rideshare app, you might be trying to get older drivers to use that instead of driving. If you work for an energy company, you might be trying to get homeowners to provide monthly meter readings. Or if you work for a fintech app, you might be thinking about how you can get people to set a weekly budget. And these are all behaviours that we might seek to change that behavioural science can help us with. It's worth noting at this point that today I'm going to largely focus on what I would call behaviour change for good. That is essentially getting people to do things that either they want to do or will deliver outcomes that we know that they want. There are ways to manipulate people into doing things that they might not choose to do within products, or things that might not be good for them in the long term. My addiction to Instagram is definitely evidence of this. But I could talk all day about this dichotomy and kind of where the decisions lie about what's good. But generally today I'm going to focus on what I would consider to be social good goals, such as being healthier, being more environmentally friendly, etc. So as user researchers, we lay the foundation for what gets designed and built, and it's no different when we're trying to change behaviours. And by bringing behavioural science into our research, we can maximise the chances that the insights that we produce will lead to a successful product in that sense. We can't change what we don't understand, and so the first step of changing behaviour is understanding it. And you can get this understanding without behavioural science, but the science increases your chances of getting it right. It's not anything particularly new or wildly different from what you'll be doing at the moment. It just adds an additional layer onto your existing research processes. Behavioural science can help at all parts of the product design process. So today I'm going to focus on specifically how it helps with research. So how can it maximise the impact of our research when we're designing for behaviour change? Now, behavioural science unfortunately doesn't provide us with a magic bullet, tell us exactly what to do to change things. Just like all research and design, it's a process. And what behavioural science gives us is a toolkit to guide us through that process. So a number of things that we can bring into our work that increases our chances of being successful in changing behaviour. Now, there are three broad categories of items that I would say in the behavioural science toolkit. So firstly, there are methods. So these might be research approaches that we might not have considered that can expand our existing user research toolkit. Next, there are theories and frameworks. So these are distillations of lots of previous research which can help to enhance our understanding. And lastly, there are techniques and interventions, so tried and tested ways of changing behaviour. These are more useful in the design stage. So today I'm going to largely focus on the methods and the theories and framework stuff. So starting with methods. Now, behavioural science uses many of the same user research methods as you'd be used to. So for example, qualitative interviewing, surveys, etc. I'd say the main additional method that I use as a behavioural scientist, rather than when I was kind of only doing user research, is literature reviewing. So some of you might already use the scientific literature in your work, and if so, awesome. And also, I'm really, really sorry that I'm about to tell you lots of things that you already know, but I promise you this bit's only short. In my experience, when it comes to literature reviewing, we often as user researchers don't get the time to do this. And a lot of us might not have ever been taught how. Now, when it comes to thinking about behaviour change, it's highly likely that academic researchers have already done research into the thing that you're interested in. So there's probably already scientific papers out there that talk about that behaviour that you're trying to change. So for example, what are the common barriers to it and what works to change it? This isn't a replacement for primary user research. We should still ideally all the time be doing that. But what it gives you is a large amount of knowledge that you can then test with your own users. And the screenshots that I've put here on the slide are just some papers from some quick searches that I did around the behaviours that I mentioned earlier. So rideshare usage, meal planning, financial budgeting, and providing energy meter readings. So hopefully you can see that literature reviewing has the power to give you an enormous amount of knowledge in very little time that can really help to kind of supercharge the research that you're already doing. I think about it in terms of standing on the shoulders of giants. So again, sorry if I'm telling you things you already know, but if you're not using the scientific literature yet, here's some tips to get started. So firstly, Google Scholar is your friend. It's essentially just a search engine, but it searches only peer-reviewed publications. And once you've kind of found publications through Google Scholar, you can then look at the reference list. So what other papers have they cited? And then Google Scholar will also give you a list of citations. So which more recent papers have quoted the paper that you found. It also helps to focus on reviews, and systematic reviews are simply where somebody has looked systematically for all of the studies on a topic and then summarized them. Sometimes they combine the results statistically, and that's called a meta-analysis. Essentially, all this means is that they've read hundreds of papers, so you only have to read one, so it's a massive time saver. The logo on the slide is from Cochrane, which is the gold standard source for reviews within the health domain. But yeah, I'm sure that there's stuff in variety of domains that could be useful to you all. It's also worth saying that looking at papers which are relatively recent is also a good idea, because obviously things change and findings often, get disproven. Although I would say in academia, recent is kind of the last 5 to 10 years. So things move a lot slower than they do in the commercial design field. Lastly, many papers are behind paywalls, but there are ways around it. So Unpaywall is a really great Chrome plugin which scans the internet for a legally available full text of the paper that you're looking at. ResearchGate is a really great platform where academics often post PDFs of their papers. You can also contact the authors or academic friends to see if they'll give you access. It's also worth noting that there is a non-legal option called Sci-Hub. I am obviously not advocating that you use this because it's not legal, but just full disclosure so that you're all aware of what is out there. So for my final point on methods, I just wanted to talk briefly about how thinking about behavioural science and behaviour change might impact our interviewing style. Some of this is just good research practice, but it's hopefully always worth reiterating. So firstly, it might impact the kind of questions that we ask, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. But I think the most important point is to ensure that you really dig deeply to get to the crux of the problem. So for the majority of behaviours that we're seeking to change, particularly in the health domain, which is the area that I've worked mostly in, people will often tell us that they don't do things because they don't have time. However, it's rare that this is actually the case. It's often that people just have other things that they choose to spend their time on instead, which is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what that means is that it's a motivation issue. It's about how highly they're prioritizing the behavior rather than an issue of time, and giving people more time, therefore, might not actually change it. So I tend to do a couple of things to dig into behaviors more deeply. So firstly, get an understanding of their life and how the behavior does or doesn't fit into it. So you shouldn't just be asking about the thing that you're interested in, but also everything around it. Behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum, and you need to be looking at what other behaviors are occurring either in that person or the peer person around them that might be influencing it. Secondly, I think it's also about focusing on specific episodes of behavior. So for example, times when they did or didn't do it, or something that's very similar. And it can really help to deeply explore what happens in these situations. So what were the actual triggers and barriers? And that really helps us to get to the bottom of the problem, not just what people think or believe the problem to be. Just need some water. So I would say the main category of tool that behavioural science provides us with is those theories and frameworks that really help us to understand people and their behaviour. And these can help to guide us in which questions to ask people, what to look for in our research data, and even the best way for us to change that behaviour. Today, I'm just going to talk through a few examples. I mean, there's tons, so it's only a small number, but just to kind of introduce you to a few that could be useful in your work. So the one that I have used most probably is the COM-B model, and this is from Susan Mickey and team at UCL. And this is a consolidation of lots of different psychological theories, all kind of consolidated in something really simple. So it provides us with this simple framework to help us to understand behaviour. And the model proposes that in order for a behaviour to happen, people need three things: the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity to perform the behaviour. Capability might be about whether they have the skills or knowledge that they need, or whether they have the mental capacity to perform the behaviour. So literally, are they capable? Perhaps if we were thinking about changing people's eating habits, it might be that they don't know what a healthy diet looks like, or maybe they don't know how to cook healthy meals. Opportunity is about the things that are external to the person. So for example, do they have the resources that they need? Does their physical and social environment support the behaviour? Perhaps they don't have healthy foods available at their local stores, or they can't afford them, or perhaps they eat a particular way because the people in their family do. Lastly, there's motivation, and this is the most important, but sadly also probably the most difficult to change. And it includes conscious reflective processes, such as weighing up the pros and cons and deciding it'd be, yeah, it's a good idea if I change my diet. But it also includes automatic processes, which can often be more powerful. So things like habits and desires that might drive us to keep taking the biscuits from the packet next to us because it's both easy and delicious. Hopefully you can see that depending on what the barrier is out of these three, the solution that we design for people might look very, very different. So COM-B gives us a really great intro to understanding behaviour and how to change it. It ensures that we think about a breadth of factors that might influence what someone does. So for example, often we, or the person that we're talking to, excuse me, might focus on how someone feels about the behaviour and their motivation, but they might neglect to talk about or think about the factors that are external to them outside of their control. And we can use COM-B to design discussion guides and surveys or analyse qualitative data to make sure we're exploring all of these factors. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. The potential downside is that COM-B in its simplest form is quite high level. So it doesn't necessarily help you get to the nitty-gritty of those in the moment factors that might drive behaviour. An example of a framework which does this well is the CREATE framework by Stephen Wendell. Now, Wendell is much more focused on what behaviour change looks like in product. So this model is much better at explaining whether people do or don't act in the moment within your product. The framework suggests that the first hurdle when taking an action is that it must be cued in some way. So something internal such as hunger, or external such as a reminder needs to prompt them to even think about the behaviour in the first place. For example, if you want your users to log their meter reading, you might send them an email prompting this behaviour. Once they've received this cue, they then have an initial reaction to it, an automatic response. And this is often driven by social factors, trust, experience, or how familiar it is. For example, you might get the email about submitting your meter reading and you don't actually like your energy provider because they keep overcharging you. So you have an initial automatic negative response. Next, they consciously evaluate it, weighing up those pros and cons of acting. So within our meter reading example, you might take time to reflect on it and decide that in order to avoid overpaying in future, it's probably better to submit a reading. Next, ability factors come in. So for example, you might not know how to read the meter or read the meter, or you might not be at home in that moment that you get the cue to do it. So you're literally not able to do it. The next factor is timing. So how urgent does it feel? For example, if I need to do it before my next bill arrives and I need to do that by the end of the week, that makes it more urgent. It might be more likely to do it. And then lastly, experience factors come in. So if, for example, last time I tried to submit a meter reading, a website bug made it really difficult, I might be less likely to do it this time. And this funnel is really useful in helping us to understand why users might be dropping off in the run up to taking an action, and more importantly, know how to then intervene to change it. It can inform things like how you conduct user testing to understand every step of that funnel, or even how you interpret your analytics data. So Create helps us to understand the different micro steps in acting. But what if we need to have a deeper understanding of how people feel and their motivations? A useful theory here is self-determination theory. I'm aware that there's a lot of stuff on this slide. I'm not expecting you to kind of read it and take it all in. I'll share the slide so you can kind of dig into it later. But essentially, self-determination theory suggests that humans are driven by three basic psychological needs. Firstly, autonomy, the need to feel empowered and a sense of choice and control. Secondly, competence, the need for mastery and feeling effective. And finally, relatedness, so the need for connectedness and feeling and belonging with others. The theory also talks about different types of motivation on a continuum from poor quality external motivation to high quality intrinsic motivation. And if we satisfy basic psychological needs, we're more likely to increase the quality of this motivation and therefore more likely to enact sustained change in behavior. Self-determination theory can guide us in thinking about where people are on that continuum and how well met their psychological needs are. And this helps us to understand and explain their motivations and then work to create things to increase it. Lastly, many of you are likely familiar with the cognitive biases that are often talked about in the context of nudging. Now, these can be really, really useful in thinking about what drives people's decisions, particularly for one-off behaviours. And a nice framework which explains these really well is the friction and fuel framework from the Centre for Advanced Hindsight. And this can help you to understand how to use certain factors which might drive behaviour. So, for example, social norms, incentives, or biases such as the sunk cost bias. So that's just a really small number of examples of the tools that might be in your toolkit, but how do you actually use them in practice? So the first thing to address is how to choose the right tool. So I've only talked there about 4 theories and frameworks that might be useful to understand behavior. And as I said, there are loads more out there. On the one hand, this is amazing, having all of these tools at our disposal. However, there's also an issue of choice. So if I'm new to behavioral science, which one should I use? And a big part of my role as a behavioral scientist is to help people to select the right tool for the job. However, in the absence of having a me on your team, there are some general steers that I can give you based on the frameworks we've talked about today. So if you're new to the space and working with long-term or repeated behaviours that sit outside of your product, so health behaviours, for example, I definitely start with COM-B. If you're working on product-specific behaviours, for example, how to get someone to use some or do something in your product, maybe think about using Create. If you know motivation is important and you want to design to increase it, use self-determination theory. And lastly, if you're thinking about how people make decisions for one-off actions, perhaps considering the specifics of design and copy decisions, think about using those things from friction and fuel. Aside from this, I'd say be guided by your initial desk research and literature reviewing. So if there's a theory or framework that's often used in your space, then try that. It's also worth mentioning that they're not mutually exclusive. So often you might use kind of layer one thing over another. So for example, I've often used COM-B and then brought in self-determination theory if I've realized that motivation is a very important factor. So once you've selected your framework, what do you do with it? And to illustrate this, I'd just like to give you an example of what it looks like to use COM-B in qualitative research. One way we can do this is by using it to inform the questions that we're asking. So imagine that we are doing some interviews with people to understand how we can help people to reduce their salt intake. We'd usually start with open questioning to understand unprompted responses, which we can then dig into. So have you ever tried to reduce your salt intake? Why and why not? Then if people don't cover particular barriers, we can have questions prepared to quiz those things specifically, such as for capability, asking them about which foods they think are high in salt so we can test their knowledge, or asking about their cooking skills. For opportunity, we might be asking about where they buy groceries from, what's available to them in their environment, or what do those people around you tend to eat. For motivation, we might ask just straight up, how motivated do you feel to reduce your salt intake? And this really taps into that reflective, conscious motivation. Do they actually even care about it in the first place? But then we can also tap into those automatic factors by asking questions around what kind of things that they enjoy. On the other end, we can also use frameworks like COM-B to analyze data. So with our salt intake example, imagine that we have this snippet from one of our interviews. So we asked them to tell us about the last time they had a meal high in salt and walk us through it. And this participant said, it was probably on Friday when I last had a takeaway after work. I wanted to pick something up for dinner on the way home, but I'd left too late and the shop was shut. When I got home, I looked at in the fridge at the few bits of veg that I had left, but I'm no good at creating my own recipes, so I knew that I couldn't cook. I was tired and stressed, and to be honest, I was just really craving a pizza, so I just ordered Domino's. We can see here that capability, opportunity, and motivation all come into play. So the shop being shut is an opportunity issue. The inability to cook without a recipe is capability, and craving a pizza is about motivation. Across the entire interview with this person, and then across the interviews with all participants, we often see which are the more important factors to target. So for example, here, if we targeted capability and opportunity by providing the right ingredients for an easily preparable, really appealing meal, the person might not give in to their cravings, and that motivation thing might be less of an issue. Finally, here's an example of the use of literature reviewing in practice. So when I was working at Babylon Health, we had to work quickly to think about what content to include in our messaging around inviting people for COVID vaccination. As you can imagine, this kind of a need that arose quite quickly and needed resolving quite urgently. We therefore had a bit of a lack of time for user research, unfortunately, and I know that's not a good excuse to give to a room full of user researchers, but ultimately it was kind of literature reviewing or nothing at this point. So in just a few hours, I was able to find some evidence to guide us with this. So luckily, given that it was a rather pertinent, urgent topic for a lot of people, a group of academics have produced a rapid systematic review on this. So I could read this and look at a few other papers to quickly generate some guidance on the type of messaging to use and how to help us to maximize uptake. So one conclusion was that making benefits social by emphasizing the impact on others could be a really useful strategy. And as you can see here on the right, our content designers went on to incorporate this in the messaging that they designed. So to sum up, behavioural science can really help us to understand behaviour more deeply and make sure that we're covering everything, and therefore gives us a better chance at changing it. Literature reviewing is a really useful tool to expand the amount of insights that you can generate in a really small amount of time. And frameworks and theories can enhance the user research that we do to ensure that we've really understood all those potential facets and drivers of behaviour. And lastly, there's some books that I'd recommend here. The one in the middle is definitely a must read for anyone working in behaviour change and design. It's called Engaged by a brilliant behavioural designer called Amy Bucher. She does a really good job of integrating theories and frameworks with knowledge of design. If you're interested in COM-B and using that, I highly recommend the Behaviour Change Wheel Guide on the left. And if you're interested in Create, then I highly recommend Stephen Wendell's book. But yeah, that's it from me. I've seen that the chat's quite busy, so I imagine there might be some questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Rosie. I don't know, Rick, if you wanted to, do you want me to take the questions? I can't hear Rick. Okay, I just wanted to pick up on one question that actually Ben has answered, but I wonder if Charlie actually had a slightly different question. So Charlie asked the question, I've always been interested to go and do a master's degree in this area, and it's not clear if Charlie meant UX or behavior change. So Ben has answered the question for UX, so you all covered if you wanted that, Charlie, but Rosie can maybe answer the question if you're interested in learning more about behavior change. Rosie, do you have any?
Yeah, for sure. So I will caveat this to start with and say I'm definitely biased because I used to work at UCL, but the main one that I would recommend is UCL do a Masters of Behaviour Change if you're interested to do a whole Masters, but they also do shorter courses, like they have a summer school and then a short course as well. So I would definitely recommend looking at their resources.
Brilliant, that sounds good. And do you have anything more not university, like where like some, oops, sorry, did you mention online resources as well that are not university?
No, so those ones that I mentioned were all UCL. It really depends what area you're trying to get, what area of behavior change you're trying to get into. So I know that in the States, a company called Irrational Labs have various online courses, but then they're kind of more at the, I guess, at the behavioral economics, cognitive biases end of behavior change, whereas the UCL stuff is more the psychology end.
Brilliant. Rosie, you can see the questions as well, right? Do you want to take...
if I open them, hang on.
I can also just read them out for you. So Sophie has a question for you, and she's asking, are capacity, opportunity, motivation the big three areas we should try to research in and then design for, or is it more nuanced than that? And if not, is there one that often weighs in more? So I think she's trying to see how to organize and prioritize.
Yeah, so with regard to like whether it covers everything, whether it's kind of complete, the idea of COM-B is that those three factors, like the people who design the framework propose that should cover pretty much everything. Some people might argue against that. There might be kind of more like cultural factors that it doesn't consider, but generally if you think about COM-B, that it should cover those things. There is also a more specific breakdown of COM-B called the theoretical domains framework, which gives you kind of a bit more detail about each of them. In terms of like where to focus and where to prioritize, it really depends what you're doing and who you're working with. Like what populations, and I think that's why it's so important to make sure that you're doing your research to understand it. In my experience, motivation tends to be the area that you often go deep into, but it really depends on what you're doing.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Sophie, just to say, Rosie is also, like you, very active on Twitter, so I'm pretty sure you can follow her for some morsels of wisdom. Rosie, there's lots of other questions. Do you want to pick? And I'll look for the ones that are in the chat as well.
Oh, okay. Gigi asked, what's an example of a one-off action that might be suited to friction and fuel? So a lot of one-off actions that have tended to be used in this space tend to be things like signing up for a pension, organ donation, those kinds of things where it's like a decision that you have to make, and normally you make it once and then it kind of, you know, it then persists. Like you don't have to, it's not something that you repeatedly have to do. Question about the techniques and interventions. So I've got various previous talks that I can share recordings of where I kind of talked about a little bit more broadly, but the thing that I tend to recommend most to people is the behavior change technique taxonomy. Is probably the first place to go with that. How does someone at a startup access this kind of thinking for UI, UX in fintech? So, I mean, if you haven't got this expertise internally, I think it's about skilling up. So with the resources that I've mentioned, definitely it's something that you can bring into your own work. And then I think aside from that, if you need more than that, there are lots of people doing freelance consulting in this space. So I'm in-house at the moment, so I don't really tend to do any of this, but yeah, I have various friends who kind of do that if people need something a bit more specific. Anya, were there any others that you think I should definitely pick up?
I think so. There is a few in the chat. There was one person, now I can't find it anymore. That's the problem with the chat. One person who said, is there one framework that you would advise to stay away from?
Oh, that's a big question. Not necessarily stay away from, because I think that like every framework's designed for a particular thing, so therefore it's good for something. I think that one framework that I've seen that's potentially like taken and then lifted and used for things that in my mind it doesn't really apply to is the Hooked framework, which is largely all about like habits and rewards and how to get people coming back to your product. And bringing that into a space, particularly in my mind around health and things, it's just like not necessarily fit for purpose. But if you're using it as a way to engage with your, if you want to increase engagement with your product, then it's a great framework. So I think really the lesson is about choosing something that is fit for purpose. So yeah, and like this talk's kind of the beginning of my thinking on this, that I plan to expand in more talks and blog posts and stuff. So watch this space for more guidance on choosing the right tool.
Okay. I think maybe there's this, I think, hold on, this is more UX question. Guys, the UX question Ben can answer in writing and maybe a little bit later, because he just told me he has a screaming 1-month-old that he's just attending to. So we'll get back to you on that one. Rosie, what about the one from A. Bayliss?
Yeah, on unintended consequences
Yes.
of interventions. So the example of the scared straight intervention in the US to reduce criminal behavior and actually ended up educating them to be a better criminal. Yeah, I think this is something to always watch out for. So I think that getting that initial understanding will really help. So for example, like with the kind of like scared straight stuff, what we actually know, if you look at the literature, is that fear-based interventions to kind of like alarm people, on the whole, don't work. So if they'd have talked to a behavioral scientist in the first place, they probably would have said, probably not a good idea. But what I would say is the other end of the behavioral science process for me is you design something, you put it out there, and then the other end is measuring impact and looking at what happens. And that is a really important step that you shouldn't skip. So you should be like measuring the things that you want to see, but also measuring to check whether you're having unintended consequences and kind of feeding that back in. So that build, measure, learn cycle is really, really important in behavioral science and behavior change interventions.
Great.